Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Glenn Ivey. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me.
You are part of the bipartisan task force investigating the attempted assassination against President Donald Trump. You were on the ground at the site in Butler, Pennsylvania earlier this week. So can you talk to us about that experience of actually being there?
Sure. I thought it was very important for the task force to go. I'd had a chance to go up with the Homeland Security Committee about a month ago before the task force was formed. And I think we all thought it was important to go back and have a chance to see it in person. And I think that's right. One of the things you notice when you first get there is the number of rooftops that are there and how difficult it would be for the Secret Service and state and local law enforcement to cover all of those. And I think we saw the results of that on July 13th. And so I think one of the things that we all kind of came away with was a sense of how important it is to make sure that at the front end of all of this, you pick the right site and give the protection teams the best opportunity to perform their functions. And I think the selection of this site, I think, informs the challenges with that going forward.
We've obviously seen video from that disastrous day, but being on the ground, you have a firsthand view. So when you're there, when you're walking through the site, seeing all the different buildings, did you have any additional questions? Were any additional questions raised being there?
Certainly. I think the coverage of the rooftop where the shots were actually fired from is sort of at the front end of that. Why wasn't there a better job done of covering that rooftop? What role did the Secret Service play? What role did state and local officials play? What was the breakdown in all of that? And a second big issue that we saw was apparently there were two communication centers that were there instead of one. Why do you have two communication centers instead of a unified command center, which you'd have in most of those kinds of situations? Because you want to have real-time communication so that if something does emerge, you have some sort of crisis that pops up, everybody can talk to everybody else from the law enforcement side directly or quickly. And that was another failure that happened as well. So there are a number of those that I think are going to pop up as we move forward. I think the short run issue is Secret Service taking in this information and making sure they make immediate adjustments, because they're still in the role of protecting, whether it's the former president or the vice president or whoever, people who are out there giving speeches and protecting the public. We need to remember that a spectator was killed that day and two others were injured because of this breakdown. So we want to make sure that the candidates are safe, that the spectators are safe, and democracy can move forward in the way that it should.
When you were there, when you had these additional questions, did you have the chance to speak with any additional law enforcement, whether it be local, state, or federal level?
Yeah, great question. After the tour of the site, we had a chance to meet with 4 different law enforcement agencies, all local, and talk with them about what happened that day, what their recollections were, what recommendations they would make. And I thought that was very helpful as well. There'll be other conversations, I think, with them. And I think the FBI has done interviews with them as well. But it's important for us to make sure that we hear from everybody that we can. We don't have to duplicate interviews that, for example, have been conducted and recorded, say, by the FBI. But I think it's important to make sure that if there are any holes or gaps in the information that we've been provided, that we can fill that. And then in addition to interviews, we're going through, over time, documents that have been produced. Some of that will be email communications, say, among law enforcement, and also communications with the Trump campaign as their role in selecting the site and making decisions about the protection that was provided that day. There are going to be radio communications. There's body camera footage. There's a lot that we need to go through, and we don't have a long time to do it. The report's due on December 13th, so we really have to hustle to get this done.
There's a lot to get through, as you said, in a short amount of time. But what do you think that this task force, in the past few weeks, since it was created, in the 6 weeks since the assassination attempt, what have you guys achieved so far, do you think?
Well, I mean, big first steps obviously are putting together a staff. You need the lawyers on board who can conduct the interviews and help to gather the information and do any kind of legal research that might be necessary. So putting the staff together took a little bit of time, but that's in place now. We needed to consolidate documents or information that had been gathered by other committees. I serve on Judiciary and Homeland Security. Both of them had already had hearings on this before the task force vote took place. So we had to reach out to those committees and say, give us the information that you've collected, papers that you might have received from requests for information that you sent out to those agencies. They also had hearings, so we got the transcripts from those as well. And then also gathering together information, like I mentioned a moment ago, radio communications, body camera footage, and the like. So we want to gather all of that together, and that's just on the federal side. We're trying to do the same thing on the state and local side as well, keeping in mind that they have investigations that they're doing as well. There's a criminal investigation that's being conducted. Like the FBI at the federal level, there's a state version of that that's going forward. There are investigations that they're doing to make sure that they have accountability on their side, just like we're doing with the Secret Service. Were mistakes made? If so, who made them? We know that mistakes were made overall, but one of the things we have to do is specifically get to who made the specific mistakes, how those mistakes were made, and how we can correct them going forward. And then we need to make sure that the protocols that are in place, certainly between the Secret Service and local law enforcement, in coordinating protection for these visits, that's got to be improved as well. Clearly, that didn't function the way that it should have. And then there's particular one-off issues. For example, the shooter scouted the area out with a drone earlier in the day before the shooting took place. Apparently, law enforcement either lacked the capacity to put a drone up or failed to do it for some other reason. We got to make sure we understand what's going on with that, because drones are in widespread use right now. We've seen how effective they can be in Ukraine and Israel from a military standpoint, but from a reconnaissance standpoint, as we saw with this, they can be important too. And we need to make sure that the protection groups are able to meet fire with fire on that front.
I had the privilege of speaking with you just a few days after the shooting last month, and you said the two major questions are what went wrong to let this happen, and how do we ensure this never happens again? Do you think you're any closer now to finding an answer to either of those questions?
I think we've made some strides moving forward. I think we need to make sure we conduct a full and thorough investigation, though. I don't think we have to have a rush to judgment before we reach final conclusions and recommendations. The only thing I would set off separately from that, though, is the Secret Service review to make sure that it's making immediate changes in the protection that it provides so that we don't have breakdowns going forward. We've got the former president and the current vice president out doing rallies every day on the campaign trail. Their candidates on their slates, their vice presidential candidates, need protection as well. And for spectators at these events, we want to make sure that their lives are protected too. We lost a spectator on July 13th and two others were injured in the shooting that took place on that day. We got to make sure that they're protected at these rallies as well, because democracy is at stake. And we have to make sure that people who want to go out and have a chance to hear from the candidates can do that without putting their lives at risk.
To that point, do you think that presidential candidates and rally goers are safe on the campaign trail because we're less than 3 months away from a presidential election?
Well, obviously, I think there was some degree of overconfidence that led up to July 13th. We've got to make sure that whatever that was gets stamped out immediately and corrected. And I think that we've already seen some things that should be changed already. Just a quick example. Unified Command on July 13th, there were 2 command posts. And so instead of having a single one, you had 2. And what that meant was that because not everybody was on the same radio frequency, Secret Service might have been on a different one than some of the state and local police departments. And some of those departments weren't necessarily on the same frequency either. So when somebody spotted the future shooter, the guy who was going to end up firing the shots at former President Trump, it took a moment to relay that and then get it connected to the Secret Service. And then the shots that were fired, there was a sighting immediately before the shots were fired. Might have been not enough time to do anything with that, but maybe there would have been if you'd had unified command. And the second aspect of that is, even if you can't preempt the shooter in advance, if you get the information to the people who were handling the former president and took him out on stage, can you say, why don't you guys wait a minute? Or, we've got an issue, get him off the stage immediately. That's the kind of real-time communication we want to make sure can take place in events going forward.
Something that I was really impressed with watching the press conference in Butler, Pennsylvania, is that Republicans and Democrats alike on this task force repeatedly said, this is bipartisan. We're not Republicans or Democrats here. We're working together as Americans to find out what happened and how to prevent it from happening. So can you talk about the bipartisan nature of this task force and what the conversations are like working across the aisle here?
Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air to be able to work in a bipartisan way. I mean, as you've covered what has gone on in the House of Representatives the past year and a half, and a lot of it's, sort of partisan tactics and things that haven't really moved legislation forward. But it's good to have the House Republicans come forward. In this instance, Speaker Johnson reached out to Democratic Leader Jeffries. They found a way to come together, put a task force together that is, largely bipartisan. There's 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats, so it's not an even split. But the way Chairman Kelly's running it is he's not differentiating between Democrats and Republicans at either the member level or the staff level. So I think it's been much more productive to do it this way, more efficient, more effective, and I think it's going to lead to a better outcome and result at the end of this.
You also said in a press conference on the ground earlier this week that you've been through similar investigations as a staffer both in the House and the Senate. So can you walk us through what those are like, how those go, so we know what to expect?
Well, I worked on the Whitewater hearings in the Senate. That was significantly different in some ways. It was a very partisan investigation. And also another big difference was it sort of stretched out over 4 years because of the Republican effort to try and undermine President Clinton in the upcoming election, which didn't work. But, this one so far, at least, has none of that. It's been very bipartisan. In fact, it's been nonpartisan in a way that it's almost unique to my experience here in Congress in the past year and a half. And the other big difference is the timeline. As I said, Whitewater dragged on for 4 years. This has the final report due on December 13th. So we don't have a lot of time to be, trapped in partisan bickering or politicizing these, very partisan and frightening situations here. We've got to make sure that we can move forward with this quickly, put out the information, explain our recommendations, and make corrections that need to be made. And I think we're going to, in the process of doing that, knock down a lot of these conspiracy theories that are floating around on the left and the right, and make sure the American have full and correct information about what happened that day, how we've corrected it, and how we can move forward.
Well, Congressman, as those developments come to, I hope you come back on, break them down with me. Thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate it per usual, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thanks for having me, and I look forward to coming back soon.